Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Robert George. I'm the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions and McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence here at Princeton. It's a real pleasure to welcome you, most especially the new freshmen. Welcome to Princeton and welcome to the Madison Program. This will be a presentation, an intellectual presentation, followed by an open house at which we're going to be serving some barbecue, and everyone is welcome to stay for everything. So feel free to do that or to come and go as you need to. This particular event is part of the Madison Program's initiative on freedom of thought, inquiry, and expression, which is co-chaired by Professor Keith Whittington, who's one of our presenters today, and by Professor Bernard Haeckel of the Department of Near Eastern Studies. While Professor Haeckel is on leave this year, Professor Gregory Conti is filling in as co-chairman with Professor Whittington of the project, and we'll be having activities under the auspices of the project related to freedom of thought and inquiry the entire year. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Madison Program, we're a program of the Department of Politics here at Princeton, focused on enduring questions of American constitutional law and Western political thought. If you'd like to learn more about what we do and the many opportunities available to students, especially as members of our Undergraduate Fellows Forum, which you're welcome to apply for to become an undergraduate fellow in the Madison Program, just go to jmp.princeton.edu. You can also follow our social media accounts, such as our Twitter account @Madison Program. You can also sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our Madison's Notes podcast, and learn more about our upcoming events, most of which are in person, but some of which will be virtual. We also welcome our guests, the people who are not students, friends of the Madison Program, and I hope you'll visit our website too and see the many opportunities that are available for you. This afternoon's focus is on free speech rights of students. In 2015, Princeton University adopted formally by faculty vote the University of Chicago's free speech principles. Those are very broad and protective principles that are entrenched in our university statutes called Rights, Rules, Responsibilities. That's section 1.1.3. You can see that I'm a lawyer. There's also a little more in 1.1.4 that's relevant, but the heart of the matter is in 1.1.3, and I would encourage you to memorize those provisions because they are so important to the intellectual life of our community. The name of the principles, the University of Chicago Free Speech Principles, gives away the game as to who developed the principles. But Princeton was the first university after Chicago to adopt them, and the first university of all to adopt them by faculty vote, rather than them being imposed on the university by the Board of Trustees or Board of Regents or what have you. And we're very proud at Princeton to have those principles, but it's very important that they be more than parchment guarantees, more than merely words on a page. And so we have to be vigilant to ensure that those principles are honored, that we ourselves, as faculty members, as students, as members of the staff, respect those principles and demand that others respect them as well. This presentation will feature two very distinguished people. First, I'll introduce Professor Keith Whittington, who is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics here at Princeton and the founding chair of the Academic Freedom Alliance. Professor Whittington is also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He works on American constitutional history, politics and law, and American political thought. He has literally written the book on free speech in universities, the book entitled Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Freedom of Speech, which a few years ago was the freshman pre-read. I would like to make it the pre-read every year, in new editions every few years. He's also the author of the book Repugnant Laws, Judicial Review of Acts of Congress from the Founding to the Present. Professor Whittington is a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, Georgetown University Law Center, the University of Texas Law School. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He served on the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Texas and completed his Ph.D. in political science at Yale University. Myles McKnight, class of 23, is not yet a professor. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude from Princeton with a degree in politics. As a student, he was president of the Princeton Open Campus Coalition, our student force for free speech on campus. was managing editor of the Princeton Legal Journal, and was concertmaster of the Princeton University Orchestra. He worked for Judge Dermot O'Scanlan of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and for the Appellate Division of the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. He also served as concertmaster for the National Youth Orchestra of the United States. He now works as a public discourse fellow at the Witherspoon Institute here in town and as a research assistant to, well, me, and for the James Madison Program. Professor Whittington will go first, followed by Myles McKnight. Professor Whittington has important business down in Texas, where he'll be testifying as an expert witness in an important constitutional matter, state constitutional matter, actually, down there. So he will have to leave a bit early, but he'll give his presentation first. Myles will give his presentation. Then we're going to open the floor for discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Whittington.
And thanks for coming out. I'm glad to see such a large group today. I think it's an important topic. I have to admit, it's a topic that I mostly took for granted, certainly when I was a student and through much of my early academic career as well. I was focused on other kinds of issues in my own scholarly work, and I thought universities seemed fairly secure in how they thought about speech rights and how much they protected speech rights in general. The last several years, though, has really shaken my confidence on this front, and as a consequence, I've spent a lot more time and energy thinking about speech rights, in particular in the context of universities, both relative to student speech rights, but also faculty speech rights. And those issues aren't entirely the same thing, but unfortunately, I think we've found both of them under serious threat in our current environment. And so it's worth thinking carefully about not only what right people have in universities, but also why they have them. What's the point of protecting broad speech rights in a university context? And especially when it comes to student speech rights, the point is not entirely obvious. Ultimately, universities are educational institutions. The goal is to convey information between those who have some expertise, hopefully, and those who are trying to learn. And that emphasizes the importance of having faculty with a capacity to explore controversial and difficult ideas. It doesn't necessarily imply, though, that students should have the opportunity to explore difficult and controversial ideas independently of the faculty themselves. Plenty of misinformation can be generated by student speech that universities might not be concerned with wanting to protect and may have an active interest in trying to suppress in some ways. So unsurprisingly, faculty speech tend to come first in universities, historically speaking. That when universities began to provide more robust protections to speech rights, the first focus was on faculty, what they did in their research, what they did in their teaching. It's only much later that universities really began to systematically and formally protect the rights of students to engage in speech as well. So why should we even worry about student speech rights, and what does that look like in a university context? So I think at heart, the goal of being able to protect students engaging in their own speech rights still fits within the larger purposes of universities being places in which we can talk about controversial, difficult ideas in general. It is true that students are often amateurs in talking about some of those ideas. They're exploring ideas in a new way. They perhaps engage in debates that don't meet the kind of standards that we would expect academics and faculty to engage in. Students may well be interested in exploring topics and ideas that the faculty think have largely been debunked and are actually not worth exploring and not worth time. And maybe particular speakers students are very interested in hearing from, or not the speakers the faculty themselves would invite. Nonetheless, we have gradually carved out space on university campuses in order to allow students to be able to explore ideas on their own, not only in the context of the classroom under the immediate guidance of faculty, but also throughout the campus as a whole. And that's come not only in an expectation that students then have an opportunity and right to engage in speech of their own, engage in speech activities of their own on campuses, but we've also expanded it out to say things like students, for example, have their own right to invite speakers to campus, where you can very easily imagine a university campus operating such that the only outside speakers who come to campus are people being invited by the faculty or by the administration themselves. Somebody's invited to the Department of Politics to give a talk here, which we may or may not open up to the students to listen to, but nonetheless, the invitation is being extended by the politics department. We have vetted and sponsored that. We think this is speech worth listening to as a matter of faculty judgment. It's only relatively recently, historically speaking, that we've opened that idea up and said, not only should the faculty extend those invitations, but we should make room for students to extend those invitations as well. The students should be able to invite who they want to hear from without having to ask the permission of the faculty, despite the fact the faculty may not even think that's a reasonable person to spend your time listening to. But the students themselves think it's an interesting person to listen to. They think they will learn something from engaging in those conversations. And so they have been given the opportunity on university campuses to bring people to campus for them to engage with and for them to learn from, even if they're not of interest to the faculty themselves. This carries with it a real responsibility on the part of students. We've given a great privilege to students, and especially at a place like Princeton, tremendous resources to students to extend those kinds of invitations, as well as the right to be able to extend those invitations and invite people to campus and sponsor them in university buildings and rooms and the like. That's not only a real right that students have and a privilege they have, but it's a real duty and responsibility that students have about how they exercise that. We have a responsibility when we're thinking about who to invite to campus, whether we're doing it in the context of the James Madison Program, whether we're doing it in the context of the Department of Politics, whether you're doing it as part of a student group, for example, to really think through, why are we bringing this person to campus? What are we hoping to learn? What kind of ideas are we hoping to engage? What kind of conversations are we hoping to spark on this college campus? Unfortunately, I think it's sometimes tempting for students in particular to invite people to campus who are primarily there to be provocative, primarily there to stir up an argument and a fight. And instead, I think it's much more useful to think about the valuable time you have here, the limited time you have in a place like Princeton, to try to bring people to campus who you think are worth hearing from, who you think will help you explore ideas, think more deeply and seriously about ideas, will put ideas on the table that your fellow students can potentially learn from and take opportunities from. When we talk about speech rights in a university campus context, they're very different contexts depending on whether we're talking about a state university or a private university. Princeton's obviously a private university, and as a consequence is not bound by First Amendment rules. Princeton is only bound by its own contractual rules. What kinds of policies and rules has Princeton established in order to protect students' speech rights? That's true of the University of Chicago, for example, which is also a private university. And places like Princeton and Chicago have made a commitment of their own to say we're going to offer very expansive and robust speech rights to students as a consequence of our own commitment for the kind of university we want to be. We want to be an open university where ideas can be freely discussed, no matter how controversial and difficult they are, even if there's only a subset of the population of the campus community that wants to have that particular conversation. We've said there's ought to be freedom to have pluralistic decisions about what kind of talks to sponsor, so that even small subsets can invite people to campus and have those conversations. They can form their own student clubs to engage in those conversations themselves on campus. They can publish newspapers and create websites, engage in activity on campus to express those ideas. That's the kind of university campus Princeton wants to be. And I think it's a very attractive model for how universities operate in general. State universities, on the other hand, also have to grapple with First Amendment constraints. These two are relatively new as they've been developed over time. Courts in the early 20th century tended to think there were no particular speech rights worth worrying about on a college campus. That was certainly true for students on a college campus, even at a state university. That's not true anymore. Courts instead now have a robust sense about the extent to which First Amendment protections apply on state university campuses, because state university officials are themselves arms of the state. And as students on a state university, you don't lose your rights as citizens, but you instead still have speech rights in that context. But to exercise those speech rights in a manner that's compatible with how the university operates in general. Those same principles that form rules that judges are willing to impose as on a First Amendment basis in public universities tend to be the same kinds of rules that private universities are thinking about too. That we want to create space for people to engage in speech activities as students, as faculty, and as other members of the campus community. But we also need that those kinds of discussions and conversations and how that speech activity is taking place is compatible with the broader educational goals of the university. As I know, one way of thinking about that is to say, well, the way in which we make those speech activities compatible with the overall educational mission of the university is to deeply constrain what students can talk about, because they should only be able to talk about the things that professors think are important, are valuable. That's not the kind of constraint we've imposed, but it's still the case, for example, that we can't have students, because they're engaged in their expressive activities, disrupting other people on campus. Right? You still have to have classrooms where you can teach. You can't have a protest in the hallway that's disrupting the classroom. You certainly can't have protests in the classroom that's disrupting the classroom. That we need to have the campus be a place where we can coordinate our activities, where the activities we're engaged in is compatible with other people also making use of the university campus to pursue their own goods. But in that context, there's plenty of space to engage in protest activities on campuses. There's space to engage in very robust and vigorous disagreement about ideas on a college campus, with the key concern being, even though we have those disagreements, we're still part of a common campus community. We're engaged in a common project. We're trying to learn and think through ideas in a serious way. And we also respecting each other's right to be here and their right to participate in their own activities consistent with ours. Those are sometimes complicated rights to mesh together, but universities have to be committed to it. And likewise, as students exercising speech rights, you should also be thinking about, how am I contributing to this university campus in a positive way? And how am I engaging in exercising my own expressive activities in ways that's compatible with what other people are trying to do on campus at the same time? Thank you.
Well, let me just take a minute to start by welcoming members of the class of 27. As someone who just graduated from Princeton, I can say if you're here, you're already off on the right foot. I can think of very few forums during my time at Princeton where I had such immediate access to really intellectually meticulous crowd of people from across the political spectrum. That was always very impressive, and I was greatly appreciative of all of the funding and extracurricular trip opportunities to meet Supreme Court justices and senators and the like. And so if you're here, I think you have my congratulations already. It seems in this neck of the woods that everyone and their mother these days has something to say about free speech and academic freedom. Last week, President Eisgruber gave an address with Anthony Romero, president of the ACLU, about the topic. President Eisgruber gave last year, no fewer to my count than 3 speeches about academic freedom. Committees have been formed, conferences organized, new centers established, including one just established yesterday. So you get the gist, it's on people's mind. But let me give you a warning. Think critically about these issues will often mean parsing through abounding sophistry, pretexts, and rationalizations. But you, everyone here, can count yourselves among the lucky because you've just benefited from a magisterial overview of the importance and status of academic freedom at Princeton from the man who literally wrote the book, the man sitting to my right. I myself have been fortunate to deliver a few speeches about this issue, and though I stand by what I've said in the past, I'll admit that by this point I'm a little bit bored by myself sometimes, so I'm going to try to do something a little bit new. This speech that I'm about to give is for those of you who are already hard at work, whether or not you're members of the Madison Program, doing the work of the Undergraduate Fellows, which is to think critically, deeply, and for yourselves about these issues, and to question everything, including the vision for free speech that Professor Whittington just laid out. So this speech is for the free speech skeptic, just as much as it is a speech for those of you who are fans of free speech but who are in search of solid arguments as to why we value this thing in the first place. So I want to get a little bit into the weeds, talk a little bit about some philosophy and some epistemology, and I hope convince you that, as a matter of fact, a reverence for free speech and robust discourse is something you must require of yourselves if you aim to be educated, thoughtful, and even intelligent people. So let's begin. There are some propositions that are senseless, truly senseless, meaning that by simply having a grasp of the meaning of the terms in the statement, one knows the statement can't cohere and cannot be true. Such statements are logically self-defeating. So for example, the statement, "my toddler is an adult," is literally incoherent unless you're using the term adult metaphorically, because by working from at least some common understanding of the definition of toddler and adult, one grasps that the same person can't be both things in the same respect and at the same time. But there are other forms of self-refutation that aren't logical self-refutation. So sometimes a statement, for example, the statement, "there is no such thing as objective truth," is self-defeating not because it's incoherent in the same way that the former statement was, but because the very activity of articulating, the very act of articulating the statement testifies against its soundness. So someone who denies the objectivity of truth, in my view, after all, is affirming something about the nature of truth and intends that you or I treat his statement as worthy of acceptance as a proposition, as true. So if there really were no such thing as objective truth, one would simply have no basis for accepting, even in the privacy of one's own conscience, the truth-pretending conclusion that objective truth is a fiction. So the point I want to make here, and this is crucial, so I'll underscore it, sometimes the very act, the very activity of uttering a statement, inescapably, like it or not, reveals the speaker's reliance on preconceptions, ideas, value commitments that cannot be coherently denied. So let's take a claim about free speech. For example, the claim, some ideas should be off the table for consideration in the academy. Such a claim, whether communicated through language or proposed to oneself in thought, in the privacy of one's thoughts, takes the form of a claim dealing in concepts, in intelligibilities, in reasons. Thus, one accepts or treats that claim as worthy of defending, acting upon, or even thinking in the first place, because he or she makes several judgments about its soundness, about its truth. It coheres, it stands to reason, it doesn't rest on any false empirical judgments, etc., etc. So how does this get us to free speech and academic freedom? Two related but distinct concepts, as Professor Whittington makes abundantly clear in his book. Well, if you take for granted that our university community has as its central aim, that is, as its common good, the objective which unites our community in purpose, which makes intelligible our association in this community, the truth-seeking mission, you've already accepted, willy-nilly, like it or not, the idea that propositions, whether normative, like the proposition that abortion access should be available to all, or empirical, like the proposition that affirmative action actually decreases the number of disadvantaged minorities in STEM, these claims are to be accepted only after making judgments as to their adequation, which means their truth, their logical coherence, their correspondence to data, their causal validity, etc., etc. Anyone aiming to evaluate such claims or arrive at the answer to any inquiry whatsoever must, like it or not, deal in reason's currency, which is a currency, as Professor George so often and rightly reminds us, is a currency, in his words, consisting in arguments, reasons, and evidence. It's plainly an epistemological error, an intellectual failure to set aside as unworthy of consideration arguments that one finds to be taboo or offensive, provocative or unsafe, just because they are those things. To be sure, many such arguments, say for example the so-called flat earth theory, can and should be dismissed, at least in my view, but dismissed as false, and as false because one knows them to be such by considering them. So it is with arguments about abortion, affirmative action, jurisprudence, systemic racism, socioeconomic injustice, the existence of God, William Shakespeare's reliance on heteronormative paradigms, whatever, and every other issue, fundamental or benign, that you might engage, you freshmen, during your time here at Princeton. So in short, an enthusiasm for truth, an enthusiasm for truth-seeking requires not only a respect for, but a reverence for, and I would go so far as to say, even a quasi-religious reverence for the epistemological fundamentals of judgment, which presuppose the necessity of argument, debate, and discourse. Now, you will never find a reason for, and so you can never authentically justify to yourself, in your own reflection, the dismissal of ideas on the basis of how you feel about them, as opposed to how you reason about them. Such a reverence, I think, entails one's duty to promote, foster, and enhance a culture of robust discourse. Thus, our personal obligation, and when I say our, I mean not only the obligation of students, but also faculty and also members of the community who are in some way involved in the public discourse, our obligation as truth seekers to protect a culture of academic freedom emerges. This insight was the content of the speech that I delivered to the class of 2026 during their freshman orientation last year. And I'll just close quickly by quoting that speech, which, if you're interested, can be found published in the Public Discourse, which is the journal of the Witherspoon Institute here in Princeton. Back then, I said, and now I repeat, that the thing that gives us some hope that we could someday abandon our own false judgments, and we all have them, or even let go of false dogmas so deeply embedded in our cultural framework that very few even question them, is free speech. It is the free exchange of ideas and the entertainment of dissenting points of view, offensive though they sometimes are, that gives us hope that we can eventually arrive at some grasp of the truth. But That hope is crushed, decimated for all of us, no matter our political orientation, when free speech is either formally injured, as by overt censorship, against which we have the protections of the Chicago Free Speech Principles, or when informal, and this is more important in my view, an informal academic culture atrophies, and expressions of dissent either A, are no longer held in high esteem, revered, B, are no longer regarded as opportunities for engagement and intellectual growth, or C, provoke unreasonable social backlash and marginalization, causing students with unique viewpoints from across the political spectrum, or any spectrum of ideology, to shut up rather than to engage. So formal protections for free speech are important, but the informal culture bearing on the expression of diverse points of view is vastly more critical when the truth-seeking ideal is at stake. Therefore, I propose that we should all celebrate our university's formal adoption of the Chicago Free Speech Principles, an initiative in which Professors George and Whittington were deeply involved, and for which we should applaud them and others. These principles provide robust protections for freedom of expression and protect your rights as new members of our community to speak and write openly. But at the same time that I say that, we each must recognize that we all have a critical role to play in making sure that our common good, which is the truth-seeking ideal, is cherished and protected by our shared culture. No matter how impressively our institution stands behind free speech, the truth-seeking endeavor will be destroyed if Princeton students, and I mean you individually, each and every one of you personally, every single one of you, fail to foster an atmosphere in which the vigorous exchange of ideas is considered tantamount to a sacred patrimony. So this insight, I hope you now agree, is disclosed, as I've argued, by our own intellectually meticulous reflection on our own deliberations about truth, judgment, and the necessary conditions for the truth, capital T truth, to be sought, obtained, and promulgated.
Thank you. Yesterday we had the first faculty meeting of the year, the September faculty meeting. That's a very celebratory occasion where the Dean of the Faculty, Dean Jean Jarrett, introduces the new members of the faculty to their faculty colleagues. Professor Gelza is there sitting right behind me. But interestingly, and for the first time in my memory, and I've been here 387 years, actually 38 years, the president, in this case President Eisgruber, opened the faculty meeting, very first words out of his mouth. He opened the faculty meeting by saying that we ourselves here at Princeton are being affected by attacks on academic freedom that we find across the United States today. And he spoke specifically of social media and other campaigns to force professors to remove certain books or readings from their syllabi, their reading lists, and pressure on universities to get rid of professors or other officers of instruction whom they have hired. And although he didn't mention it explicitly, clearly he had in mind, in the front of his mind, the controversy in the Near Eastern Studies Department about a course in which a book is assigned by an author who has accused the Israeli Defense Forces of operating in a particular way, a brutal way, in order to harvest organs from Palestinian victims who they shoot. And he was also referring to the School of Public and International Affairs hiring of Robert Malley, who was a controversial figure, former State Department official, both in the Obama administration and the Biden administration, who is evidently now under a suspension and an inquiry into his own activities with respect to Iran, who's now a member of the SPIA faculty. And President Eisgruber made very clear to us that if any of us come under these campaigns, us being faculty members, come under pressure, come under attack from social media, mobs, the university is going to stand behind us, and that the university simply will not in any way yield to these campaigns, whether they have to do with trying to force professors to remove books from their syllabi, or whether they have to do with the university removing faculty members. So that's right in the front of his mind, and he laid it before the before the faculty. So I'd like to begin by raising for Professor Whittington and for Myles a couple of questions that I think relate indirectly to what President Eisgruber has in mind. The first has to do with courses and with readings. I think we all take it as axiomatic and would agree with President Eisgruber that professors must have the freedom to decide what their students should be required to read for the courses. This is a matter of the professor's own expert judgment. Students obviously don't decide what they'll read for a course. Somebody's got to decide. In most cases, there may be very special circumstances in which this is true, but in most cases, you don't want the central administration deciding what's in a course, so who else is going to do it but the professor? But that leaves open the question, well, what is a sound decision? What sorts of decisions are sound when it comes to assigning readings? And President Eisgruber, in his remarks to the faculty yesterday, made the point that the other side of the coin here is that people, colleagues, students, alumni, friends of the university, critics of the university, all have the right to criticize what professors assign. That's free speech too. They don't get to dictate, they get to criticize. So that raises the question, what are the legitimate grounds of criticism of professorial decisions about readings? And so I want to put before our two panelists what seems to be the heart of the question here on these issues, and that is, what's the difference between a professor using his or her judgment to assign texts that he or she thinks are really important for the students to read, or the most important ones for the students to read given the subject matter of the course, and indoctrination? This is obviously the worry that critics have. They're not so much worried about the professor assigning this or that particular book, at least the critics who are not hysterical. What they're worried about are professors presenting students with simply one side of issues on which reasonable people of goodwill disagree. Now, no one, I think, says the university should be doing investigations into whether a professor is indoctrinating his students, but I think everyone would also agree that university professors have an obligation not to indoctrinate their students. Indoctrination is the opposite of education. So let me put it to the panelists. What is your perspective on the question of indoctrination relative to the authority and duty and right of university professors to assign the readings they think are required?
I think there is a sort of difficult distinction to be drawn between teaching and indoctrination. As long as faculty have been advocating on behalf of the notion that they ought to have a fair amount of autonomy, independence, and freedom to organize the class the way they want, to have the discussions that they think are appropriate, to assign the materials they think are appropriate, it's long been recognized that the outer bounds of that is that professors ought to be teaching but not engage in indoctrination. Much tougher to define indoctrination and practice or see particular examples of it. In general, I think I'm extremely skeptical of wanting to infer that professors are abusing their authority in this regard as a consequence of what they're assigning. There's all kinds of reasons you assign materials. You assign materials sometimes because you think they're extraordinarily interesting and good, and you want students to encounter it. Sometimes you assign materials to students precisely that you know or think or is in fact bad and full of bad arguments, but nonetheless it's important for students to engage in those arguments, see how they play out. There are things you assign in classes that you expect you'll be very critical of when you're teaching them, and other things you expect to be praising over the course of the semester. So I think it's very hard. We've seen some of this now of exemplars of people criticizing faculty and universities for the books they're assigning per se, and often objecting precisely on the notion that it's somehow indoctrination to expose you to ideas and writings that you as a student would disagree with, for example. And I think that's essential to what the university process ought to be, is you ought to be exposed to ideas you're going to disagree with. You ought to be exposed to ideas that are going to be challenging to you. But you also should expect that professors in their classroom are going to allow an actual critical response to that material, that they're going to be willing to actually have a robust discussion of the ideas at stake, rather than simply putting before you, here's a set of ideas that you have to accept, We're not going to talk about potential problems. We're not going to talk about potential objections. We're not going to tolerate criticism of those particular ideas. And so a true university education is committed not only to exposing you to difficult, controversial ideas you might disagree with, but also giving you an opportunity to discuss those ideas in a critical way. And if you're not getting that out of your university education, you've been let down.
Yeah, Myles, let me take advantage of your having only very recently been a student yourself, and you're undoubtedly not finished with being a student since you'll go on to graduate study, I'm sure. Poll after poll after poll, including a recent poll here at Princeton, shows that students are self-censoring. That students in class and out of class are, in many cases, not saying what they truly think. We're not weighing in on an issue on which they have an opinion or something to say. In many cases, the students' own account of this self-censorship is that they fear reactions from their fellow students, especially debates in social media or discussion of their views in social media. But sometimes it's fear that professors will retaliate against them in grading. Do you think those fears are warranted, or what do you make of the self-censorship?
Well, they absolutely are warranted. I mean, at least I think the main issue, as I said in my speech, when it comes to causing students to think twice about articulating points of view that they might think won't be well received, the main issue is the academic culture. It's not top-down administrative policies and so on. We have pretty robust policies here. What it is a cultural phenomenon, and that's a difficult thing to wrestle with because that cultural phenomenon goes beyond just our university. It's something that's infected or present in culture among young people in America all over today. And so, yeah, the main threat, as I see it, to free expression is not coming from professors and not coming from administrations. It's coming from a student culture that students who are ready to cancel and ready to cause some sort of marginalization or backlash or exclusion on the basis of students holding views, not entertaining the possibility in their own mind that the person articulating this view, with which I disagree, might be a reasonable person of goodwill, and not holding fast to sort of the principles, the epistemological principles of judgment that I referenced in my speech, which require one, if one is to be a serious thinker, aspire to be a serious thinker, to entertain their own fallibility, the possibility of their own fallibility, and also the necessity of engaging arguments with which they disagree, if they are to honestly hold the views that they advocate. I do want to say something about the controversy that you're referring to with the professor in the Near Eastern Studies Department who assigned this book, because I've been thinking about it, and I think this situation actually raises a number of very complicated questions. So we should be careful to draw a distinction between, on the one hand, the ethical or pedagogical obligations professors take on personally when doing their part to form critically thinking students, and on the other hand, administrative authority vis-a-vis those professors. And so it could be true that a professor has a responsibility to treat subject matters delicately, or might be failing or falling short in his or her duties to present materials in a way that spurs the critical, unaffected thinking that we should all aspire to. A professor might fail, but then there's a separate question. So there wouldn't necessarily, in principle, then be an injustice if the university were to correct that professor's syllabus, in principle. But as a matter of practice, the prospect of having universities intervene in the construction of syllabi like that, or the creation of materials, is really, really dangerous and quite scary. And then there's this other argument that's been circulating around about this course in particular, and I call it the both sides of the argument approach. And this view says, okay, if this professor is going to present this book about the Israeli Defense Forces, she has to present a view on the opposite side. So this is the so-called both sides perspective. Now, it's important in thinking about how professors curate materials to understand that it's not the subject matter of the discussion, say abortion or same-sex marriage, that determines the proper curation of the materials. It's the specification of the question, the precise question that we're trying to get to the bottom of, that will inform which set of materials we're going to select. So to illustrate this distinction, if you have on the table the normative question, should same-sex marriage be legalized, a proper approach to evaluating that question requires one to consider competing points of view, and a professor would be falling short in his or her pedagogical or ethical obligations if he or she only presented material on one side. But the question, for example, how has social science been used to defend same-sex marriage, isn't a question per se about same-sex marriage, but it's about argumentative methodology. It's about methodology. And what that question requires for evaluation is an ample sampling of different methods used, different modes of argument used to employ social science in support of whatever argument. So in such a case, you wouldn't need both sides of the argument in order to get narrowly to an answer to that question. Now, however, and this is really fanatical, however, what often happens in such cases is that the professor evaluating, say, the claim about social science and same-sex marriage will smuggle in to his or her presentation normative judgments about the issue, aside from the question about argumentative methodology, thus putting on the table a new question with which people can engage differently and have different points of view without allowing for the consideration of diverse points of view that's proper or necessary to evaluating the question. Or professors will allow students to introduce normative judgments, allowing, in such a way, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but in such a way as to allow the conversation to become distracted from the objective, and then fail to see to it that now that the normative question is on the table because it's been introduced by this or that student, we're considering it in a serious way, considering different points of view. So the issue about the both sidesism is actually rather complex, difficult to think about, and something that's worth bearing in mind when it comes to this professor's course in the Near Eastern Studies Department. We simply don't know exactly what the nature of the question, the specification of the question is on the table, and so it's improper for persons to, to criticize her decisions without having access to that information.
I'd like to come back to the point Professor Whittington made in response to my question, because I think it's such an important one. I think what we can say for sure is that it's just dead wrong for a professor to require students to agree with him or her on disputed points on which reasonable people will disagree. And that's just about everything these days. We're a very pluralistic society. And I think it's a real danger. There should be a red light flashing that so many students report that they are self-censoring. So I want to say to the students here that on behalf of the Initiative on Freedom of Thought and Inquiry, if you feel in any course that you are not being treated fairly, you don't have an opportunity to speak your own mind, if you'd like to bounce that around with people, let me know, let us know. The Initiative on Freedom of Inquiry is meant to make a difference at Princeton when it comes to these sorts of things and to be supportive of you. We might not agree with you. You might think, you know what, you're just being thin-skinned. You're just not willing to, take on board a different point of view and consider it in a serious way. Nobody's doing you any harm. Nobody's being unfair to you. Or it might be that people are being unfair to you, the professor's being unfair to you, or you're being treated in a way where you're really not being allowed to disagree with a professor. So, we want to help when it comes to that, or be supportive, including critical. Could we shift to the question of viewpoint diversity? That's come up in both of your comments. There's free speech, but you can have pretty much unbridled free speech in a community on which, on all the important questions, everybody's of one mind. You could have groupthink and free speech. In that situation, it doesn't seem to me like the free speech is worth much. If the free speech is going to be worth anything, you've got to have viewpoint diversity. Now, there are some universities that we can point to in the country, or especially some small colleges we can point to in the country, where there doesn't seem to be any viewpoint diversity at all on the big important questions, the questions that are debated so intensely in our society today. At our university, there's certainly some viewpoint diversity. I think we're comparatively very good, although only comparatively. There still are dominant opinions and more marginal opinions. What are your perspectives, both of you, we'll begin with Professor Whittington, on the role of viewpoint diversity in the university's prosecution of its mission?
So I think the universities are clearly falling short on this dimension. It's always been the case that faculty tended to lean left in universities. We know this as long as there have been serious empirical studies of university faculty. But that's become much more true over the last 30 years or so. And so the levels of homogeneity that we find on university faculty now is historically unusual, and I think fundamentally detrimental to what we're trying to accomplish. I think there are consequences for that on the scholarship side and the quality of the research that we produce and the kinds of questions we ask. It, I think, has consequences for how much public faith there is in universities and how much trust there's going to be to the work we do in universities. But more fundamentally, I think there's also issues relative to the education we provide to students. So to take this kind of example of sort of assignments in a class, for example. So you may well think that a given faculty member in a given class has no particular need, and maybe it's even counterproductive, to do a both-siderism about what kind of assignments they're going to make in class. Right? You may want to organize your class precisely in order to cover in some depth particular kinds of points of view, particular kinds of perspectives, and there's others you might want to represent, but maybe it's not appropriate or necessary to do it in this particular class. So the kind of example I always think about in this kind of context is not necessarily the one that just came up, but instead one that generated a fair amount of controversy online a few years ago, in which a very well-respected Marxist sociologist was teaching a graduate class on Marxist sociology, in which he had a massive 100-page syllabus filled with Marxist sociology, which then conservatives objected to and said, this seems like the most wasteful class in the University of Wisconsin system generally, which it may have been for its own substantive reasons. But I don't intrinsically find it particularly troubling that that professor had such a class with that kind of point of view, with that overwhelming set of materials. It was useful for the particular questions he wanted students to explore in that class. It was a useful way of doing it, and students would have gotten a tremendous education from the quality of that professor exploring that particular subject. The larger concern I tend to have is not necessarily the problem of what's happening in each individual class, but the problem is it happens in all the classes, right? And so then you start worrying increasingly that the sets of materials you're going to be exposed to, the sets of ideas you're going to be exposed to, are not only limited and cabined in a single class, but it's not that you can take the next class over and suddenly now you'll get a whole different point of view, a wider array of readings, a wider array of perspectives, but instead you're often still going to wind up with a truncated point of view. And that's bad for us as an academy. The university isn't doing its job very well. If you take a whole menu, if not only do you walk out of a single class saying, there are perspectives relevant to that class that I didn't hear, but if you walk away from the entire university and a whole course of study and still have that feeling that there are perspectives I should have been exposed to but didn't get exposed to because the university is too narrow in how it conceives of its mission, too narrow in what it does. And unfortunately, I think that's true in a lot of university work today.
Myles?
It's in principle possible to have a group of completely homogenous thinkers who are serious about the truth-seeking mission. Such a group, by the way, will consider in their deliberation, in their academic work, a diversity of perspectives just because that's required, right? So recently, this summer, I had the privilege of sitting in on a working group of philosophers from this sort of the same school of philosophy, all of whom shared roughly the same philosophical commitments and many of the same moral, political commitments. But what I observed in this group was that, in a situation where it would be so easy for these men and women to fall into their silos and sort of set aside the requirements of truth-seeking and just become, just rationalize prior commitments and predictions, this group was completely serious and absolutely rigorous and, completely just meticulous about getting to the bottom of the issues they were discussing and presenting the strongest arguments against their positions and really zoning in on them. So it's possible for that to be the case, but the fact of the matter is that there is a tendency among human persons to fall into their silos and to become comfortable with the views they already have. It's a question of comfort, not of reason, but of comfort and feeling, and then to rationalize to themselves the acceptability of that view. That's just the weird old backwards view, and that's the view that those people have, and I don't really want to touch that and get involved in that. That's possible, and this group that I observed was pretty exceptional. I think in a broader university community, you have much more of the possibility of the silo thing happening. And so, not for principled reasons, but having made a practical judgment about the failings of persons in general, it's required, therefore, for fact-based reasons in the real world, to have a diversity of perspectives which constantly nudges people to be considering, oh wait, there are reasonable, intelligent people who just completely disagree with me on these fundamental issues, and I have no excuse but to confront them, those positions, arguments, and so on, and be honest with myself, evaluating them.
Floor is open. Questions, comments, points?
Yes, back here, yes, ma'am.
Thank you guys for being here. I was curious about your perspective on the role of institutional neutrality in promoting free speech on campus. I know there are a number of departments at Princeton who feel very comfortable when something happens in the political world making a statement on behalf of their department. Do you see institutional neutrality as being essential to promoting free speech on campus, or does that affect the true situation of the university?
I didn't think it has negative consequences for how the university operates in general. I think there's a range of negative consequences it has, but I think it has negative consequences specifically for this question about the freedom of speech and academic freedom on the campus particularly. One should have no objection to, and moreover it's required by serious protection of freedom of speech, to say that faculty, for example, collectively can issue political statements of their own. So not only can they express themselves individually, they can express themselves as groups if they want to join. What's different, though, I think, is using the institutional mechanism to say, no, we're not speaking just as a group of people who agreed to sign up on this public letter, but instead we're speaking as a department, or we're speaking as a faculty for the university as such. And part of the challenge of that is because you're necessarily, once you've made that statement, indicating that some people in the department are going to be out of step. They're outside the mainstream, they don't share our views, and maybe moreover, they're not welcome, they shouldn't be in this department, right? Which may have consequences for students trying to join that department and take classes in it. It has consequences for possibly hiring faculty in the future. And it closes the door exactly on the kind of open inquiry that we ought to have for university departments more generally, right? And so if you say, we're going to lay down a marker now on this particular issue, this is our commitment, and then people come along later and say, well, you know, just as the spirit of inquiry indicates more generally, there's some problems with that argument, and might actually want to dismantle it. Very difficult to do so when it comes to those kinds of institutional statements, per se. I think the other thing I just would note in this context is there's a troubling aspect to these kind of institutional statements precisely because if what we think the institution as such ought to be doing in fact, as I said a while ago, for example, students, part of what we give them the privilege of doing on university campus is to invite speakers that we as faculty think are idiots and shouldn't be listening to, but you want to hear it from them, right? And so we make space on campus for amateurs, in a sense, non-experts to be able to say their piece. But we don't expect the faculty to do that. Right? And one thing that happens when you start issuing institutional political statements is now you have faculty who have no actual expertise, no actual skill set, now issuing statements in the name of the institution, which the actual experts on the campus may think is garbage, right, from their own expert perspective, right? So we have people in our department with expertise on war and peace issues, for example, and the anthropology department is issuing statements about war and peace issues. It's a very awkward situation relative to how you're marshaling the expertise of the university, and it sends, I think, bad signals about the quality of information the university is producing. And we're better off not engaging in that, I think.
I have an article of my own out in the Atlantic, if you'd like to look at it. It's entitled, "Universities Should Not Be Ideological Churches." And it addresses exactly this question and reinforces what Professor Whittington said. Yes, over here.
One of the bigger problems, especially on campuses like Princeton over the past couple of years, has been naming, memorialization, whether it be the Wilson School of Public Policy, as we all know has been renamed. Do you think the university has more of a prerogative when it comes to tearing, God forbid, tearing down the statue of John Witherspoon, some other things like they've already done with renaming, or do you think that also has a role to play in shutting off conversations about the nature of our history and our traditions as an institution that bear on how free students feel to challenge the university or have a certain notion of what Princeton's history means to them?
I have to admit, I think I'm of two minds about this. That whether you put a name or a statue up or to take it down, you're planting a bit of an institutional flag, and to the extent that students who have a differing view from whatever the university's view of that happen to be, or somewhat chilled by that, that's going to be true whether you're now saying, I'm putting up a statue of Witherspoon. If you've got problems with Witherspoon, maybe you're going to be chilled by that, or we're taking down the statue of Witherspoon. If you're favorable to that, maybe you're going to be chilled on the other side. I think universities do need to think very carefully about what kinds of principles they're using to make those kind of decisions. I think there are appropriate circumstances where sometimes universities, in fact, ought to remove a name from a campus building, for example, or ought to remove a statue or a portrait. But unfortunately, I think a lot of universities are rushing into this in a fairly thoughtless way. It's a kind of political posturing that is often pretty inconsistent about how it's applied, and that's, I think, fairly troubling.
Since Professor Singer's name has come up, I want to take the opportunity to say the following. Professor Singer and I teach many of the same subjects, many of the same readings. We very dramatically disagree about those subjects. But he has been a wonderful force on this campus for freedom of speech and for viewpoint diversity. He was a strong supporter of the University of Chicago free speech principles when we were pushing to get them enacted. He's a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, of which Professor Whittington was the founding chairman. He invited me to join him in creating the Journal of Controversial Ideals to provide a forum for the publication of papers that were being excluded on ideological grounds, whether right or left, from other journals. He himself has hired pro-life preceptors who he knew would be contradicting in the precepts in his course ideas that he himself holds. That is deeply, deeply commendable. And it also shows that there's no reason for issues of free speech and viewpoint diversity and institutional neutrality to be ideologically divisive issues, left-right issues. They shouldn't be. These are issues on which people across the ideological spectrum ought to be able to agree, as long as they agree with the premise that Myles McKnight has put on the table now several times, and that is that the university's object, its mission, is truth-seeking, trying to get at understanding things, advancing the cause of knowledge. If that's what we're about, and if not some political agenda, then we ought to be able to agree on the importance of free speech and viewpoint diversity and institutional neutrality, despite our differences on the death penalty and affirmative action, progressive income taxes, and abortion and everything else. Other questions? I'll go to this side of the room.
I'm afraid I have to step
You
out.
have to run, Keith? Okay, yeah.
So I apologize for having to leave early.
Thanks, Professor. I'm going to recognize you back there in the polka dot dress, yeah?
Thanks. I have a question, Myles, actually, about what you said regarding the flat earth theory, that we should just dismiss it, or you think we should dismiss it on the grounds that it's false, not necessarily on the grounds that it's ridiculous or doesn't warrant being considered. Is that always true, that there's never a place to dismiss arguments because they are, for example, dangerous? I'm thinking about in recent or in perhaps less recent history of humanity, I can think of some examples where there were actually really dangerous ideals or ideas that were shared, spread perhaps to an uneducated mass of people, and it resulted in disaster or large injustice, etc. Is that just the price we have to pay for freedom of speech, that sometimes these disasters do happen and that people choose wrongly? Or is there some place for, maybe, of course the word censorship is a little bit heated, but is there a place for dismissing ideas simply because they're dangerous, or because maybe the audience we think is not necessarily educated? At Princeton University, most undergraduates are 18 years old, so maybe it's just that we think they're mature enough to take whatever. But if we're talking to a young child, perhaps there are just ideas that we don't want to expose them to because they're not even ready for it.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. So the remarks I gave were about the individual persons, the norms, epistemological norms that I have to abide by if I am to be serious about getting to the truth of a claim, right, or a question. And what I said is that you can't authentically justify to yourself the dismissal of a claim on the basis of your disdain for it at the level of feeling, because then you have no actual reason which you can appeal to justify to yourself the acceptance of what you hold to be true, or a reason to have overlooked the other claim, bearing in mind the possibility of your own fallibility when it comes to even the most fundamental issues. So what I was talking about was the conditions for my own or your own evaluation of truth-pretending claims, and the claim is that a requirement, it's an epistemological requirement in getting to the truth, that one dismiss claims as false only having considered them as reasons, right? It's just a requirement. There's no getting around it. And then the point about the danger, yeah, I mean, having free speech is no guarantee that, first of all, it's no guarantee that truth actually will be attained, understood on a broad societal level. There is no guarantee, and there are tremendous, tremendous risks. And I think you were alluding to some of the disasters of the last century, and they testify to that risk. But then again, so the question is, and John Stuart Mill makes this argument in the second chapter of his treatise on liberty, what are the conditions requisite that need to be in place in order for truth to be attained? He doesn't deny that there are risks of things going very poorly, but what are the conditions, the logical conditions that have to be present? And maybe not necessarily logical, but practical, certainly, that have to be present in order for persons, societies, groups of people to approach truth. And those conditions being present, yes, admit of grave, grave risks.
I think we have to look at the history that you have in mind in context and really ask ourselves the question, was free speech what was responsible for that catastrophe? And I don't think you're going to find cases in which you can genuinely say it was free speech. If only we had clamped down on free speech, we wouldn't have had that catastrophe. And while I agree with Myles and with John Stuart Mill that we have no guarantee that free speech will result in the truth winning out, debated questions, it seems to me a much better bet than putting somebody in charge of saying what positions may and may not be argued for, whether it's a president or a governor or a university dean or provost or department chairman or president. I can't think, can you? Does anybody have a candidate? Can you think of somebody you would want to be the guy or gal in charge of deciding what views could be articulated on campus and what you couldn't? I don't know anybody smart enough, wise enough, virtuous enough for me to trust him. I'd rather trust the market in speech, not with a guarantee that the truth will win out, but I think with a pretty good likelihood that more often than catastrophes, we're going to get the truth and we're going to avoid the catastrophes. It seems to me the real catastrophes have come when people get either political or cultural power sufficient for them to shut down other people's speech. What happened to Socrates? It wasn't the government that got it. It was public opinion.
It was democracy.
The tyranny was democracy. Democracy killed Socrates. You wonder why the American founders never used the word democracy favorably? They did not want the United States to be a democracy. A republic, yes. A democracy, no. Right at the top of the list is it was democracy that murdered Socrates. So I think it's a bet. Ms. Parker is giving me that look that says we have gone over time, and we do want time for our open house and for you to collect your swag over there from the Madison program. I want to introduce you to some key people in the Madison program, and we're going to have food for everybody. So Debbie, what's the drill now?
Yeah, so keep your questions and mingle with each other. Maybe you want to ask your friends what they think about your thoughts. But Professor George will be here over dinner. Barbecue is out to the right, kind of in the lobby of Corwin. Grab your food, grab your drinks, come on back in here, mingle with, meet somebody new, right? Meet somebody old, reconnect. Then Professor George will introduce our fellows. The Madison program have a little bit to say about our staff and we can help you. So grab some food, keep those questions hot, and feel free to talk to